Hi, and welcome back to our study in the Gospel of Luke. I'm so happy that you joined us for this study. In this presentation, we're going to be in lesson 19 of our workbooks, which brings us into Luke chapter 21, and we'll be doing the first 38 verses of that chapter. So if you have a workbook, please open it up to lesson 19, where the questions begin on page 116. And then get your Bibles open to Luke chapter 21. We're also going to be referring back a little bit to Matthew and his account, because he does add some details that will make give us a little fuller understanding of what we're talking about here. So, the beginning of Luke chapter 21, we find Jesus in the temple, as he has been these last few days before his death. And he is watching and observing as people enter into the temple area to give their free will offerings. These are free gift offerings or donations that the Jewish people give in the temple. They're different from whether it is not a regulated tax or required tax. These are free will gifts and donations, as verse 1 calls it. In the temple area, there is a court of the women, which is where women were permitted to go into the temple. And in this section, there are some receptacles. I'm told they're trumpet shaped, where people drop in their donations for the temple. So it would have to have been in the court of the women, because the widow that we're going to talk about here in a moment would not have been permitted in the inner part of the temple, being a woman. So Jesus is in this section of the temple. He's watching as people come in and out and give their free will donations. Question 1 asks us on page 116, in what way did the widow give more than the rich? So we have lots of different people coming in. Jesus is watching and observing them, and he sees a widow walk in, a poor widow, it says in verse 2. And of course, Jesus, knowing her full situation, would totally understand and know that she was indeed poor, as most widows were in the Jewish culture. And she drops in 2 small coins. They're called mites, and they are not worth a great deal of money. 2 mites are equal a farthing, or an eighth of a penny. So a very, very small amount of money. But this woman is giving it as a donation gift to the temple. Compared to the rest of the people that were coming in, which Jesus calls them in verse 1, he saw the rich. So people that are coming in and giving out of their abundance, he's observing this, and he's comparing the two donations, and his disciples are there with him, and the people that may be around the area where Jesus is sitting. And so he makes a comment here in verse 3. Truly I say to you that this poor widow has put in more than all. So for him to say that, on the surface, it would seem quite ridiculous, because of course she's not putting in more than anyone else. She's putting in the least amount that she possibly could give. But he's not talking about monetary value here. Jesus is talking about the intent and motive of her heart. She's giving all that she has. Verse 4 tells us, for all these out of their abundance have put in offerings for God, but she, out of her poverty, put in all the livelihood that she had. She put in everything. She didn't save any out to make sure she had provisions for herself. She freely gave it all to God. Whereas the rich were more than likely giving out of their abundance. They had already provided for whatever they needed, their daily needs, and used the money for things they wanted. And so what they were giving was abundant money, money that was not, they weren't using for something else. And so that's what Jesus is talking about here when he says that she gave more. She trusted in the principle that we learn in Matthew 6:33, that if you seek the kingdom first, God will provide what you need for you. And she fully trusted in that. And we know that she put her life in the hands of God. knowing that he would take care of her. But she, out of her love for God, wanted to give what she could, and that was all that she had to give. So she came to the temple and she put it in the treasury receptacle. Jesus wanted the others to see this because in chapter 20, he had just talked about the hypocrisy of the scribes and Pharisees and other leaders of the people, and how they gave to be seen of men, and they gave out of their abundance, and they gave probably pretty large amounts of money. But he wanted to compare that and contrast that with this woman's heart. She was not in any way a hypocrite. She was fully devoted in her love to God and wanted to show that. And this is how she chose to do it. She didn't care if she didn't have anything else left for herself. She wanted to give it to God. So he points this out, and her example is here in the Gospels. It's also recorded in the Gospel of Mark for all to read and learn from and observe on her example, because it was a tremendous example for all and the understanding of what God looks at. He looks at the heart, the intent, and the motive and thoughts. He doesn't care about the outward show that we might think is so important by putting in a large amount of money as a donation. She doesn't care about any of that. She simply wants to do what she can. So that takes care of the first little section here in chapter 21 of this marvelous example of this sweet little widow who wanted to do what she could, and that's all she could do, but she didn't let that keep her from doing what she needed to do. All right, now I want to turn back before we get into the next section here to Matthew chapter 24. And I want to read verse 1 of that chapter, because Luke doesn't exactly tell us where this conversation we're going to talk about next takes place, but Matthew does. So in Matthew 24, verse 1, it says, "Then Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came up to show him the buildings of the temple." So Jesus is in a different area. He's not in the actual part of the temple. He has left that area and gone over to another area, another place where he can look upon the temple from a distance, kind of. And the disciples come up, and it says over in Mark chapter 13, then verse 1, then as he went out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, and then they're going to ask these questions that they are talking about. And so he's on the Mount of Olives, verse 3 of Mark 13, where he is being able to observe the temple somewhat from a distance, and they're admiring it. His apostles and disciples that are with him are admiring the beautiful building and the structure. And it says in verse 5 of Luke 21, then as some spoke of the temple, how it was adorned with beautiful stones and donations. So they're admiring it. They're making comments about it. It was a great source of joy and pride for the Jewish people, because this temple had been improved greatly by Herod the Great since the Romans had taken possession of the land. And he added on to the temple. He made improvements on the temple. And we know the Roman architecture is very beautiful. And so they had really enhanced the beauty of this temple. And the Jews were very, very proud of it. In John, the Gospel of John, chapter 2, verse 20, it says it had taken 46 years for all of these improvements to have been completed to its present state. And so they are looking at this temple from a distance, an overview, if you will, because they wanted to make a comment to Jesus about, since Jesus was there and had been in the temple. Now we know that Jews traveled from all over the empire to worship at the temple. All males were required to come 3 times a year for 3 of the primary feasts required by the Old Testament law: the Passover in the spring, the Pentecost in the summer, and the Feast of Tabernacles in the fall. These were the 3 main feasts that all Jewish males were required to travel to Jerusalem if it was possible and observe the feast at the temple. So it was a source of great activity, great pride, great importance in the Jewish economy and culture. Now, Jesus is going to say something to them that is going to be taken very startling um, by these apostles and disciples that are with him. And we know that he took them aside privately to tell them this information. So he's no longer surrounded by the multitudes here, but he's with his disciples primarily, the men that he has been with the longest in these 3 years of his ministry. And he's going to share this information with these men. Number 2 of our question asks, what did Jesus promise about the stones of the temple? And that is in verse 6 of Luke 21. These things which you see, the days will come in which not one stone shall be left upon another that shall not be thrown down. So this beautiful, magnificent building that they're all standing there admiring, Jesus says one day soon it will be destroyed to the point where not one stone will be left on top of another. That would be greatly startling and upsetting to anyone who was a Jew at that time. How could this be? What do you mean this is going to happen to our temple? What in the world is that going to, how is that going to happen? Which is the next question we have, question 3. What question did the disciples ask that Jesus was answering in this text? And that goes down to verse 7, where so they ask him, saying, Teacher, but when will these things be? And what sign will there be when these things are about to take place? So they want more information. They're asking for further information here. They don't argue with him or disagree with him. They just simply want to know, wait a minute, when is this going to happen and how? How will we know that it's getting ready to start? So now he's going to go into a discourse where he gives them the principles and the information that they're going to need in order to prepare themselves and any other Jewish people that they have influence on for the coming destruction. This is something that is prophesied, of course, but it's something that not every Jew would have been familiar with happening or would have been necessarily expecting. So he goes into some predictions, I guess we could call them, about what is going to happen, how this temple will be destroyed, what they're going to need to do to be prepared, and therefore it won't be caught off guard, and it won't put them in a position of peril or jeopardy. All right, so he starts talking. Before the destruction of the temple occurs, there's going to be some other things that have to take place first. Now, we are, if our dating is correct, AD 30 here, the temple being destroyed in, AD 33, and the temple being destroyed in AD 70. We're talking about a span of about 37 years before the destruction will actually occur. So there's going to be some other events and other things that are going to happen before that time, and Jesus doesn't want them to be confused by all of these other things that are going to happen, thinking that this is the destruction of the temple when it really isn't. So question 4 asks, what did Jesus say must first pass? And that starts in verse 8, where he talks to them about, take heed that you do not be deceived, for many will come in my name, saying, I am he, and the time is drawn near. Therefore, do not go after them. There was going to be some confusion that Jesus knew would occur. But when the destruction started, people were going to think this was Jesus's second coming. He had prophesied about that. He had talked about that in many of his parables and teachings. So they knew that was coming in the future. So Jesus doesn't want them to become confused when some of these other things start happening, that that's what this is. So he's trying to give them the information so they can tell the difference between the destruction and the second coming of Christ. Now, he says the first thing that's going to happen is there's going to be false Christs. People are going to come and claim that they're Jesus, that Jesus has returned. And in the other two accounts, in Matthew and Mark, it goes into further detail, and it says they're going to tell you that I'm out in the desert. They're going to tell you I'm up in the mountains. Don't believe them. Don't listen to them. That's not what's going to happen. These are false teachers or false doctrines that are rumors. They're going to be spread. Don't fall prey to them. Don't listen to them. He says the time has drawn near, therefore do not go after them. Don't listen to any of that nonsense. And then in verse 9, he talks about, and that answers our question number 4, the things that are going to come to pass first before the destruction of Jerusalem are wars, commotions. There's going to be all kinds of uproar in the world. There's going to be nations against nations. There's going to be wars. There's going to be battles. This is not going to be the destruction of the Jerusalem yet. These things are going to come to pass as they do in all centuries of time, where we have wars, commotions, and then he goes on in verse, nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. Verse 11, there's going to be great earthquakes, famines, pestilence, and there will be fearful sights and great signs from heaven. These things are all going to occur in the world, in their area of the world anyway, and they are not alarmed by that, thinking that this is the coming destruction or that it is the coming of Christ. All of these things are going to take place and occur as they always have and always will, as long as the world is in existence. We're going to have these kinds of things happening. There's going to be great disturbance. It's going to upset people. It's going to put people in a terrified situation, not understanding what's happening or thinking that maybe the end of the world is coming. Because we know when there is great destruction and massacres and tragedies, that we all begin to sometimes wonder, is this it? Is this the end? And so he didn't want them to be led astray by that. He didn't want them to become so distracted by what was going on around in the world that they didn't keep their focus on what was the most important thing, which was their work for him. All right, then question 5 asks, what would be done to the Christians before all these things? He goes into that in verse 12, because there's going to be a great persecution, as we read in the book of Acts, that was going to occur once the kingdom was established and the apostles began traveling around preaching the gospel. Verse 12 tells us that they're going to lay their hands on them. They're going to persecute them. They're going to deliver them up to the synagogues and to prisons, and they'll be brought before government officials. They're going to have to be standing trial, answering questions, be interrogated. What does he say to do with these situations? Verse 13, but it will turn out for you as an occasion for testimony. And we know, reading the book of Acts, that this is exactly what happened to these men. They were brought before government officials. They were persecuted. They were held on trial. They were mistreated. And each of these occasions were to be used by them as an opportunity to show that they stood for Christ, that they believed he was the Son of God, that they were going to stay faithful to Christ in spite of what might happen to them physically. And he tells them in verse 14 that they are not to let this be unsettling to them. It says, therefore, settle it in your hearts, and not to meditate beforehand on what you will answer, for I will give you a mouth and wisdom with which all your adversaries will not be able to contradict or resist. The Holy Spirit would be with these men. They would be with them and help them through these difficult times, so they would know what they were supposed to say and how they were to respond and what they were supposed to do. And the Holy Spirit was of great comfort and help to them during these difficult times. Because if you read your secular history, we know that most of the apostles were martyred, killed, beaten, tortured. The apostle John was ostracized and exiled to the island of Patmos But he lived the longest of all the apostles. He lived into an old age. But all the other apostles were tortured and murdered and persecuted, just as Jesus told them they would be. So the presence of the Holy Spirit was of a great comfort to them during these times. So he doesn't want them to become distracted or discouraged by these things that are going to happen to them, because it's all part of the plan that God had for them. He says in verse 17, you will be betrayed. 16, you will be betrayed even by your own family members. They were going to be turned into the government by their own family members. And we know that Paul, when he was called Saul in Acts, in the first part of the book of Acts, this was one of his jobs. He went around arresting these people, putting them in prison, and he was making sure that death was their penalty. And he got this information as to who was a worshiper, who was a Christian, from other family members. They would literally turn them in to the government to protect themselves, or because perhaps they were threatened. So Jesus again is warning them, be prepared for this. This is going to happen. And he says in verse 17, you will be hated you will be hated by all for my name's sake. So they weren't to expect a welcoming reception. They weren't to be expected to be lifted up and admired. These men were going to have a very difficult time ahead of them, and Jesus is trying to prepare them for that. Don't get so concerned about when the destruction of Jerusalem is going to happen that you don't pay attention to the events that are going to happen first. And that's what these are. Now, we have a question. Question 6 asks, what did he exhort them to do in your patience? If they could patiently endure all of these trials, persecutions, and things that they were going to go through, he says in verse 19, by your patience possess your souls. They would still attain their eternal reward if they maintained their patience and endured patiently the things that they did. And we know that none of them recanted. None of them went ahead and said, yeah, we don't believe this. They were killed because they refused to say that. So they stood steadfast to the end, which means they kept possession of their soul, and then they went into eternal life for that, because they were faithful to the end. All right, now keep your focus on the end goal. It's always good advice for all of us spiritually to keep our minds on where it is we're headed. We're all headed to heaven. That we make sure we get there. For the apostles here, same is true for us today. There are so many events that happen in the world that are distressing, that are confusing, that are fearful. We could easily give up on our eternal destiny if we let these things pull us aside, distract us, discourage us, and get us to the point where we give up. So this is good information for us as well today, even though it primarily was directed toward these men in their generation. Now, they ask for a sign of the coming destruction. So Jesus is going to give them some. And he starts that in verse 20. He says, let's see if I have a question. Yes. Number 7, how would they know when the desolation was near? All right. He tells them in verse 20, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation is near. The Roman army is going to surround the city. You know, remember the cities had these walls built around them for protection, but the Roman army was going to surround those walls and build their encampments and their things to get over the wall that they used. The Roman army was a very brilliant army. They had great strategy and warfare tactics. They were not an army to mess with. And therefore, if you see the armies surrounding the city, it is time to leave. Verse 21. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let those who are in the midst of her depart, and let not those who are in the country enter her. So here's your first sign. Stay away from the city if you're not in it. If you're in the city, get out. Flee to the mountains. Flee to a place where the army will not be attacking. So that's their first sign. Destruction is going to come to the city because of the vengeance God is bringing upon them for the death of his son and the rejection of the Messiah. So it's a fulfillment of prophecy from the book of which Daniel prophesies about this book. Now, he gives a couple of other information. Verse 22, for these are the days of vengeance, that all things which are written may be fulfilled. This is, again, as I said, a fulfillment of prophecy. It's a day of vengeance. It's God bringing vengeance upon the Jewish nation for their rejection of Christ. And he says in verse 23 that there are going to be some groups of people in the city, among the people, where this is going to be very difficult for them. If you were pregnant or had babies, you would be very vulnerable during a time of this kind of chaos. And so he says, woe to them. Be careful, take special care. These people are very, very vulnerable and need to have special protection. For there will be great distress in the land and wrath upon this people. That's the end of verse 23. So the Roman army showed no mercy for anyone. Women, children, pregnant women, didn't matter. They were all slaughtered and massacred. That was the kind of warfare they engaged in. When they were coming in to conquer a city, they conquered it, and they didn't show mercy or compassion for anyone. So Jesus is warning them, take your most vulnerable citizens, make sure they're not in the city, because if they are, it's going to be extremely bad for them. So we know that many were killed in this massacre. Secular history estimates 1 million Jews were killed over the entire period of this siege, and 100,000 approximately were taken captive and taken into other parts of the Roman Empire. They were moved away from their homeland. We read about this in verse 24, and they will fall by the edge of the sword and be led away captive into all nations. And Jerusalem will be trampled by Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. All right, so he's giving them all these information so they can be prepared, they can warn others. We know that they all wrote about it in their Gospels, so everybody would have the information they need. And question 8 asks, how long would Jerusalem be trodden down? How long would this destruction take place? And it's going to be until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. The Gentiles here are referring to the Romans, who were used by God as the means of the destruction and the vengeance that he's bringing on the Jews. So when their purpose was fulfilled, when they completely fulfilled the plan that God had laid out for them, then that's when the destruction would be finished. We know that they left the city not only completely destroyed and pillaged, but they burned it. And they took all things of value out of the city and returned it to Rome as part of their trophies for their conquering. We know that the commander Titus of the Roman army was the one that led this siege, and they were very, very successful. The Roman army was the greatest army of its day during this period of time, and you had little hope of survival if you tried to stand up against them. So Jesus gives the best information he can. This would have been information very, very hard for them to grasp or understand or even believe. How can this be? How are you, I mean, it would be so overwhelming to think of their city totally laid waste. It would be incomprehensible in many ways for these people to fully grasp and fully And they didn't know exactly when it was going to happen. It's just these things are going to happen first. And then when you see the army surrounding the city, here's what you need to do. And then this is the extent of the destruction. There will be no going back to the city of Jerusalem after this. All of these people remained slaves or captives in other nations, and they were never allowed to return in force to the nation of Israel. They were still under the Roman Empire at this time. Now we know eventually the Roman Empire was destroyed by God. God used many foreign nations in the Old Testament to conquer his people and to submit punishment on them for things they had disobeying him. About 1,000 years, there's on exactly how long the Roman Empire was in existence, that they eventually fell as well. Nations rose in power and then fell in power, all by God's design. He allowed them to be in power, and whenever that was no longer needed by God's plan, that nation was brought down by another nation. So in verse 24 here, we're talking about the Romans, and there are the Gentiles being referred to. Now, you can imagine if you were a Jew alive in 70 and this destruction begins to happen all around you, wouldn't you think this is the end of the world? Wouldn't you start to question, maybe this is the end of the world? Maybe this is Jesus' second coming? Because it would seem like it was the end of the world. And in many ways it was. It destroyed the Jewish economy. It destroyed all of their genealogy records. It destroyed the temple, so there was no longer any animal sacrifices or worship they could do. The priests were either killed or in captive. Most of them were killed, so there was no priests to help them in their religion. They had to live in foreign countries where they were surrounded by idol worship because the Romans worshipped gods. So their whole life was completely destroyed as they knew it once. So they were not going to be able to ever regain what they had. They lost it all because of how they had rejected Christ. But you can see why they would become extremely fearful and confused as to whether this was indeed the second coming of Christ as well, because it seemed like it to them. So Jesus goes into, in verse 25, now we're going to talk a little bit about how to not get confused in thinking that when the destruction of Jerusalem occurs, that means Christ is coming again. Because as we know, no one knows when Christ will come again, not even Christ. Only God the Father knows. So he wanted his disciples to make sure they didn't think the wrong things that were going to happen. Verse 25, and there will be signs in the sun, the moon, the stars, and the earth, distress of nations with perplexity, the sea and the waves roaring, men's hearts failing them from fear and the expectation of those things which are coming on the earth, for the powers of the heavens will be shaken. That's the effect of the destruction of Jerusalem. So he's warning them here. Men's hearts are going to fail them from fear. Don't you be one of them. You keep your focus. You keep standing steadfast and doing what you know you're supposed to do. Let the Holy Spirit lead you. Then in verse 27, then they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. Now, when these things begin to happen, look up and lift up your heads, because your redemption draws near. Now, the Son of God will indeed come in power when he comes back for the second coming. But when this destruction is rained down on the city of Jerusalem, it's also from the power of God. It's God directed. This is part of what God purposed and planned to happen. So don't let it get you to the point where your hearts fail. You give up. You think it's all over. It's not worth it. There's no point in going on. So we need to be sure that we keep this separate. There are things about the second coming of Christ that are very, very similar to the destruction of Jerusalem in the way that things are going to happen and the effect it will have on mankind. But we do know, if we read all of chapter 24 of Matthew, that the coming of Christ is unknown by anyone and everyone except God the Father. It will come unexpectedly as a thief in the night. He will indeed come in the clouds with power. We will hear the sound of the trumpets. Those that are alive will rise up with those that raise up from the dead, and we will meet him in the air. We do know those things about the second coming, which will have nothing like that happening in the city of Jerusalem. But they were to make sure they didn't get confused or get led astray by false doctrines and false teachings that were going to be going on at the same time. Now, the parable of the fig tree is next. Let's see here. We have a question about that. What does the parable of the fig tree teach? All right. So he uses a very common example here. Fig trees were very common in the land of Palestine. And he asks them to look at the trees. And when they see the buds coming out on the tree, what does that mean? It's a sign. It means that summer is near. The tree is beginning to bud out. Soon it will have leaves. Soon it will produce fruit. This is signs of nature that we are all very familiar with. And it indicates to us the end of winter and the beginning of spring. And so these signs are useful. And so he's using them as an example here in verse 31. So you also, when you see these things happening, know that the kingdom of God is near. So they were to use the signs Jesus had given them, both for the destruction of Jerusalem and the second coming, to be able to distinguish what was happening. So they would have the right response. So they would have the right reaction. You're to be watchful. If you're a farmer, you're watching for when the trees begin to bud, because that means there is things you need to start doing. The same is true for us as Christians. We need to remain watchful so that we're ready when Christ comes again. And he wanted the Jews to be watchful so that when the destruction came upon the city, they would have the time to flee and save their lives. Now, verse 32 says, let's see, I think we have a question. No, we do not. So what the parable of the fig tree teaches is that we are to be watchful for the coming signs. There's signs all around us in nature and here in the scriptures. So be watchful of those signs and use the signs to help you understand what you need to do. Verse 32 says, assuredly I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away till all these things take place. So these events he's talking about here in the destruction are going to take place within the time frame of the generation that is presently alive when Jesus spoke these words. So they were not going to be far away into the distant future. They were going to be within the time frame of this generation, which, as you know, most generations we figure are 100 years, or give or take, from one generation to the next. So these things were going to come during this generation. 33, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will by no means pass away. This is a surety. These things are going to happen the way I have explained them. So don't think they will be changed or altered. God doesn't change his mind. God keeps his promises. He fulfills all prophecies. This is going to happen. Yes, heaven and earth will pass away one day at the end of time, but the things that Jesus is speaking about here will not. This is for certain to happen. And since we live past AD 70, we know that they indeed happened just as Jesus predicted. And that destruction was total, massive, catastrophic. All right. Let's see what we have coming up next here. I think that we have a question. Why were they exhorted to take heed? That is question number 10. That brings us down into verse 34. All right, now that I've given you all this information, Jesus has given them the signs. He's answered their questions as to when it will happen. It'll happen before this generation passes away. And these are the signs so that you know when it's about to start, so you can be prepared. So be watchful, pay attention. Then he gets into verse 34 here where he says, but take heed to yourselves, lest your hearts be weighed down with carousing, drunkenness, and cares of this life, and that day come on you unexpectedly. How easy is it for us to get so wrapped up and involved in what's going on in our little world all around us, the day-to-day things, taking care of family, taking care of the duties and responsibilities that we have on this earth. How easy is it for us to become distracted from focusing on the spiritual aspect of our lives? It's very easy, as you know. He doesn't want this to happen to any of us, and he's warning his disciples here. Don't let this happen. Don't let yourself get so involved in the things that go on in the world, pleasures, and cares of life that you forget to watch. And then it will come upon you unexpectedly, and then destruction will certainly follow. Verse 35, for it will come as a snare on all those who dwell on the face of the whole earth. Because they're not going to be ready. They're going to be totally unprepared. And whether we're talking about these Jews in the day of the destruction or us in the day of the second coming, we can't allow ourselves to become that distracted that we're not careful about being watchful. 36, watch therefore and pray always that you may be counted worthy to escape all those things that will come to pass and to stand before the Son of Man. This is why he gave them these signs, so they would have that opportunity to escape all that was going to happen, and they wouldn't be involved or caught up in the destruction of Jerusalem. He doesn't want us to become so caught up and involved in the cares of this world and the pleasures of this life that we are caught up unexpectedly, because we all will stand before the Son of Man at the end of time and answer for how we were found. Were we found faithful and watching, or were we found busy and distracted? There are so many parables in the New Testament that Jesus taught about this very principle. And he goes into Matthew chapter 25 right after this about the foolish and wise virgins and how some were prepared and some were not, and what's going to happen if you're not prepared. So we have had ample warnings and signs given to us through scripture to help us be prepared for the second coming, just as Jesus tried to prepare the Jewish people of his day for this second coming. For the coming of the destruction of Jerusalem. All right, they were to take all of these things that Jesus had just given them seriously. It was not something that they would dismiss, brush aside, oh, that's never going to happen. They were not to take an indifferent attitude toward it. They were to take it seriously, because if they didn't, they would be caught up in the destruction. The same is true in the second coming as well. So we need to all be watchful and vigilant, making sure we're not allowing ourselves to get caught up in the cares of the world and forget to take care of our spiritual life and our spiritual preparation. At the end of this chapter, we kind of get a little, I guess you'd call it an overview of how Jesus spent these last few days of his life. This is again still on the Monday and Tuesday of the last week of Jesus's life. He spends all of it at the temple in the daytime. In verse 37, it says, and in the daytime he was teaching in the temple. But at night he went out and stayed on the mountain called Olivet. Then in the early morning, all the people came to him in the temple to hear him. So he had established this opportunity. It was the last few days he was going to be in the temple before they arrested him. And he's going to use all of that time to teach and help the people be prepared. There were still people coming, willing to sit and listen to him. And as long as there were listeners, he was going to teach. And he was going to use all the time he had devoted to that. And Jesus knows fully what's going to happen to him in the next couple of days. He doesn't let that distract him. He doesn't get caught up in the cares and concerns and fear of what's coming. He focuses on the work God sent him to do, knowing that God's going to take care of him no matter what happens. That's something we need to work on as well. That no matter what coming calamities may be happening in our lives down the road, God will take care of us if we are faithful and obedient to Him. All right, so that takes care of all the major questions. Let's go into our true and false, and that's on page 117. Others beside Jesus would claim to be Christ. This is true. He warns them about that in verse 8. There's going to be people walking around saying, I am he, and they're going to be false. Those of you that have been around a while know that there have been many predictions as to when Jesus is going to come again. They're just assured he's coming on this date. And of course, none of that's ever happened. But there are people out there promoting false doctrine constantly about these things. Number 2, earthquakes, famines, and pestilences were signs before the destruction of Jerusalem. Yes, you can see that's true. Verse 11, you can see how those things might get them to thinking this is the destruction Jesus was talking about, when it wasn't. It was just other events that happen all the time in the world. So he wants them to separate those two things in their minds. Number 3, they would be persecuted by others, but not by their own family and kinfolk. That is false. They were going to be persecuted, and they were going to be betrayed by family members as part of their persecution. So it was going to be difficult for them to maintain family relationships at the same time, which is why many of these apostles left their homes and went out into the world and preached because of that, because it was difficult and they didn't want their family to be put in jeopardy. The Romans would threaten, if you don't tell us, we're going to put your family to death. And so there was a lot of threatening and a lot of fearful things going on. So some people succumbed to that and turned in their family members. Number 4, all these signs were to be fulfilled before that generation passed away, and that is true. He tells us that in verse 32. All of the signs of the coming destruction of Jerusalem were going to occur before this generation all passed away. So it was going to be in their lifetime. Number 5, they were exhorted to pray that they might escape all these things. That is true in verse 36. Now, by escape here, we don't necessarily mean they would escape harm, physical harm, but they would escape spiritual destruction. Because as we know, the apostles were all martyred and killed, but they possessed their souls to the very end. So they were saved. They escaped the claws of Satan. So we have to make sure we don't put more into these things than are meant. All right, the research question says to read Matthew 24 and Mark 13 and Luke 17, 22 through 37. And when was Jerusalem destroyed and by whom? All right, we've already talked about this one, but we'll go over it again. It happened in AD 70, according to secular history, by the Roman army led by Titus, the general commander of that time. The siege took approximately 5 months to actually completely capture and destroy the city. 1 million Jews, approximately, as if we can be assured of accurate secular history, were killed during this time, and 100,000 approximately, again, taken captive and carried away into other nations, all that Jesus predicted in this section of Luke and in Matthew 24 and in Mark 13. If you haven't had an opportunity to read those accounts, I definitely encourage you to do so. It gives you a fuller picture, a little bit more detail here and there as to what exactly was going to take place and how they were to use the information and be prepared. Our thought question asks, find several statements in this text which prove Jesus was speaking of the destruction of Jerusalem and not about events yet to occur at his second coming. The first one is going to be in verse 20, where he says, when you see the armies surrounding Jerusalem. That's going to have nothing to do with the second coming. So we know that has to do with the destruction of Jerusalem. Verse 21, they're to flee to the mountains. Why would we need to flee to the mountains at the second coming? There'll be no place to flee or to escape. We will all be involved in the second coming. So there's that would not pertain to that as well. Then in verse 22, he talks about these are the days of vengeance, and the vulnerable citizens are going to be have great hardship. That has nothing to do with the second coming of Christ. So we can know that that's all applied to the destruction of Jerusalem. And then the kicker is verse 32, where he says all of these things will take place within this generation. So I know this is a difficult subject to keep straight in our minds, because so many of the accounts that we have of this get confused and conglomerated as to which are we talking about here. Are we talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, or are we talking about the second coming? Here's my thoughts on that. Number one, the destruction of Jerusalem has already taken place. We today in this century don't have any worries or concerns about that. What we can learn from this account is that when Jesus said something was going to happen, it happened. He's coming again. So that's going to happen. So we better take that to heart and be prepared. And there are principles that we can learn from these verses that we just studied about how to be prepared, not allow ourselves to get distracted, not get caught up in the cares of the world, not to listen to false teachers and false doctrine. There's all kinds of principles we can gain from this that would apply to us today. But primarily, this chapter is talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. So I know that that can seem confusing sometimes, and he does intertwine it in some of the other accounts where the Son of Man coming is at an hour when no one knows, because he doesn't want the disciples to be confused. Because as I said, when this destruction began to occur, it did seem like the end of the world to these people. They didn't have the internet. They didn't have an instant news situation like we have. So when this started happening, they didn't know what was happening in the rest of the world. They could have easily thought that it was indeed the second coming. So this is something that we have to keep in mind when we study these verses and not get caught up in a controversy. And most especially, do not bind it on others who, if you don't believe it my way, you're wrong. That causes division, which is something that God never wants among his people. So don't take this situation to that extreme, please. Don't get caught up in listening to other people's versions of this situation. And there's a lot of them out there. So please be careful when you hear people talking about this, and not allow yourself to get caught up in something that God never intended for you to. We are to be watchful, we are to pray, we are to be vigilant, and we are to be ready when Christ comes again. I thank you for listening. I hope that I made these things as clear as possible. I am not saying that I have everything 100% accurate. I do the very best I can, but I am still learning as well. I am still a student of the Bible. And so there are things that I may not even fully understand at this point. So keep studying, keep reading, keep listening, and checking what people say with scripture to make sure it is indeed true. And we all will hopefully be ready for the second coming, so that we can possess our souls to the end. I thank you, and we will talk with you next time.